Welcome everyone to another episode of the Lofthouse Group Podcast. This week it's the Architecture Startup Stories series where we interview founders and directors of architecture studios who share with us their thoughts, their advice, their experiences of starting up studios. I'm Ryan Gorman, director of Lofthouse Group, and today we're joined by Russell Curtis, who's the founder of RCKa, a London-based architectural practice, but also really interestingly, the founder of the London Practice Forum, which a really important organisation, really great idea. More people should be kind of following their lead in what they're doing, but I'll allow Russell to explain what that is and why it's so great. But Russell, thanks so much for coming on. Really good to have you.
My pleasure, Ryan. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no worries. It's great to have you on. So we've chatted before, and really interesting story about you and the practice and setting up the forum. But I guess for the people who haven't come across the practice before, would you mind just giving a bit of an overview of yourself and who you are? And and we'll start from there.
Yeah, not at all. Okay, so our practice is called RCKa, as you said. The practice is probably around 15 years old. We set up. I gave up my job 15 years ago. We moved into our first office 2 years later. So the first couple of years were sort of getting, finding our feet, winning some work, and we've now got about 20 people now. We work from a studio in just off Old Street, and we have quite a nice breadth of work. So we're working across multiple sectors, predominantly in residential, developer-led and social and affordable housing, but also lots of community projects. We're doing some healthcare. We've just submitted a planning application for a special needs school, and also doing quite a lot of policy work. So it's quite a broad range of stuff.
Awesome. And look, for anyone listening, I think it's going to be really interesting hearing about how you got to where you are. Like, the practice is doing well. It'd be really interesting to hear how you got there. So if you don't mind, let's go back a while. And I guess even as far back as, what was it that first interested you about architecture and kind of inspired you to get into the profession?
Wow.
The big question.
Growing up, it is a big question. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't come from an architectural background. I mean, my family is not an architect, a family of architects or anything. They're all teachers. But my brother and I have one brother. We were always interested in drawing, and I love pens. And so I used to collect like Rotring pens and Rotring drawing boards, and was obsessed with buying all those amazing sort of bits of kit that people probably don't use them now, but like orange set squares and things like that. And so I used to love sitting drawing elevations and drawing buildings and plans, dream houses. And so actually I never really wanted to do anything else. It was I always wanted to be an architect, even though I didn't have any experience of what that meant. So my sole experience of an architect was when my mum and dad had a loft conversion in the house, and a guy came along and got planning for this loft conversion. That was my only exposure to it at all. So but I never ever wanted to do anything else.
That's awesome. And so you did your degree, and then talk to me about when you left university as an architect. Left university, having done your part one, started doing your work experience. And talk me through the journey of education, working in practice, to the point where you decided, like, now's the time, we're going to set up a studio.
So I actually found my part one really tricky. I didn't particularly enjoy it. I struggled a bit, and I was at some point contemplating giving up. I think partly because I'd done very well in my GCSEs, and then I didn't do so well in my A levels because I messed around a bit, and I didn't feel like it wasn't quite what I was expecting. But I persevered. I did my year out, and then I went to a different school for my part two, and which was better. And then I came down to London in '97 or something, and then worked for a number of practices of different scales for the next 4 or 5 years. And during that time, myself and some friends had started doing some bits of private work in our spare time. And it came to about 2006, and I was in a job that I wasn't really enjoying. And I thought, well, now's the time. If it was never really an intention to set up my own practice, but I just kind of felt I wasn't going anywhere. And we had a few opportunities. We had a little bit of money in the bank, having done some private work. I thought, well, I'm just going to go for it and see what happens. What's the worst that can happen? So I spent 2 years. I spent the first year working on my own home, and my two business partners, Tim and Dieter, were still working in jobs. Then after a year, Tim came on board, and we worked together from our respective homes. And then we got an office, the three of us together. And starting out, we worked mainly on domestic projects. We didn't bring any work with us. So we day one at home, sitting on my desk, I set up a website and I learned to use SketchUp. And then over the next year, we sort of did lots of things like the Grand Design Live and lots of work with the ROBA to try and build up a project, because you can't win projects very easily when you're a small practice. Particularly with private developers and public sector. So it's domestic projects for a number of years, which served us very well. So that's sort of really how we started.
How do you go when you've not got your own? I guess you've not got a catalogue of projects to show somebody. How do you go about winning those first few projects, and what are the challenges that come along with that?
Well, the domestic work was. It wasn't easy to win, but I mean, but you don't have to jump through so many hoops in order to get to it. So you have to put yourself out there, and you have to go, set up a website. And we used sort of targeted methods. So we did advertising, we used Google ads, all that sort of stuff to try and build up some momentum. We had two big breaks. We won. So I think in the first year of having an office, in fact, no, we worked on it before we set up the office. We came runner-up in Europan 8 for a scheme. So Europan is for people who don't know, is a sort of pan-European design competition for young architects. So we came runner-up for Europan 8 for a site in Zagreb, and then 2 years later we won Europan for Europan 9 for a site in Stoke-on-Trent.
Wow.
Now, like most Europans, and even that was the last year that Europan was run in this country, the scheme never went ahead, but it gave us a bit of a publicity boost. And then we went on to win an ROBA design competition for a scheme in Preston. So those got a bit of press for us. And over the years, we've pulled away from domestic projects, and we don't do any now. It's entirely public or private sector projects in different sectors.
So when you won those projects as a new studio, how did it feel?
It was amazing. I mean, as you can imagine, competing against people from across Europe. I mean, it was a real endorsement of our approach, I think. I mean, it's always sort of tinged with disappointment because neither of those schemes went ahead. So it was amazing to win, and there was a little bit of prize money associated with it. In fact, the Europan scheme halted because of various reasons within the council. The project in Preston, we did get as far as planning, and then the funding was pulled. So that was a decent sized commission for us at the time, although it didn't get built in the end in the way that we designed it. But obviously, being at that stage and having set up not long before, the competition wins were an amazing opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to, let's go back to when you first started the studio. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further back, because it's really interesting what you said about the part one, kind of struggling with the studies and not quite enjoying it, because you'd be surprised like how many of these interviews I've done with established practices where it's a similar story. I don't know whether it's just, I don't know. Most people seem to have either not been overly not done so well in their education. You kind of, I think a lot of people probably, and I might be wrong here, but a lot of people I think sometimes think that studio owners are kind of almost infallible. Of obviously to become, the head of a successful practice, you have to have been, straight A student forever and always been doing it. I think it's probably really nice for the listeners to hear that actually that's not always the case. And if you have struggled with your studies or you are finding it hard, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and you kind of there are options. There are options for you, right?
Absolutely. And I think I felt that that the kind of things that we were. I mean, you've got to remember this is this was in the mid-90s that I was doing my part one and part two, and at the time, architectural education was very much, certainly in the places that I went, was very much about architecture with a capital A. It was sort of worship of, of modernism, and and to be honest, I'm not sure that really interested me that much. I mean, I could appreciate it, but I just didn't feel that I was a strong enough designer to compete with other people in producing brilliantly creative schemes and beautiful illustrations that conform to what was expected of me at the school. Now, and it's taken a long time, I think, to appreciate that, or to realise that actually the interests that I had and I now have are entirely compatible with what I do. But I think it takes a bit of hindsight and perhaps a bit of maturity to realise actually where architecture is heading now as a discipline is much broader than our traditional vision of sitting at a drawing board or sitting in front of a computer and spending all of your time crafting beautiful building. I'm not saying that's not valuable, but that's fine for some people, but it's a much broader discipline than that. And I would be really concerned if people were put off architecture as a career because they felt that it was it was just that. It was just just about beautiful design.
And do you know what? I think we'll come back onto that topic, because I think we need to be encouraging as many people from as many different backgrounds to not to be put off by going into architecture, which I know comes into some of the work you're doing with the London Practice Forum. But going back to starting your studio, you'd started the studio, I imagine, had great ideas for what you were going to do. Talk me through how it felt during that first week of starting on your own, the realization setting in.
Well, I'm gonna skip the first 2 years, because really it's not very interesting. I mean, we had no overheads, or barely any overheads, because I was working from home. So the moment the moment, or the date that we sort of count as our start date was in 2008, when we moved into our first studio. Now, we'd signed the lease on this place, and it was tiny. I mean, like 300 square foot or something, a little rectangular weird space in a converted warehouse in Clerkenwell. And we'd signed the lease in 2007. I think almost the week that the Lehman Brothers collapsed. And so so it was full of excitement and enthusiasm about having our own studio, but suddenly oh shit, the economy's going down the pan, what do we do? We were quite careful that we didn't take on lots of debt. So I think our only sort of exposure was that we got a photocopier, that was like we had to pay for. But everything else, could have quite easily have been jettisoned had we needed to. And actually the domestic projects that we were working on carried us through a very tricky time in the wider industry. So when the financial collapse took place, actually we were okay. We took on, actually the biggest step for us was taking on first member of staff. So our first part one, Lottie, was suddenly it was not just the three of us, like friends. Suddenly we had somebody that we were responsible for, and that felt like a huge burden. looking back on it, it's insane because actually, people come in, to the office all the time, and because we have the procedures in place. But your first employee was a big thing. Was a big thing. That was scary.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it must have given you an interesting perspective setting up during a difficult economic time. Did anything that you learned by setting up during that time translate to the economic downturn that we've literally just had because of coronavirus? Because most practices that who've gone through the pandemic probably have never had to work through a difficult time. If they set up kind of post 2009, 2010, it's probably been all right. But did it give you guys an insight or a perspective that you could apply this time round?
It did, and one thing that we have always been extremely careful about is making sure that we get paid for the work that we do, and tracking our performance on projects. I can't emphasize enough how critical that is. We've, other than the funding of the photocopier, and that's still the case now, which has got a bigger photocopier, right? But other than that, we've never taken on debt. We've always maintained a decent reserve in the bank, and we've built that over time, and we know what that figure needs to be, and we've aimed for that figure to keep the practice going for 6 months, even if no more work came in. So financial resilience for us has always been a big issue. Now I think perhaps that's maybe limited our growth a little bit. So our growth has been very steady rather than exponential in terms of income and practice size. But that was really what made us resilient, I think, was being very, very careful about doing the work, getting paid on time, and making sure that we do get paid for the stuff that we've done.
That getting paid, from speaking to business owners myself constantly in architecture, seems to be a big gripe. And actually, I think I was going to come on to this later, but I think it's probably worth us introducing the concept behind the London Practice Forum, because I think we're probably going to be referring back to that as we start to discuss some of the challenges and things that you have overcome as a practice. We're probably going to be also talking about how you then collaborate with other practices in the London Practice Forum in passing on your knowledge. So for the benefit of the audience, could you just explain a bit about why you set up the London Practice Forum and what it does and what purpose it serves?
Yeah, so the London Practice Forum is a sort of an informal collective of 25 practices, and I set it up three years ago, really as a result of grappling with issues as a practice. I mean, when you set up a practice on your own, and when I say on your own, I mean with either as an individual or with friends, it's very exciting, but it's also incredibly challenging, and you feel like you're doing everything for the first time. So where do we go for advice on professional indemnity insurance? Where do we go for advice on what software to use? Where do we go for advice? All these things that we don't really talk about very much in wider discussions. And I wanted an opportunity to have those discussions confidentially and discreetly with other practice leaders of similar practices to our own, who I knew a lot of. I mean, we all talk at events and chat about things, and so this network already existed of practice principles, and we could have conversations about these issues. But it felt like there should be a formal framework for that. So we set up the practice forum. Initially, we had 21 practices. We've now expanded it to 25, and we're now looking to expand that further. And we're working. We're looking at a number of different, issues at the moment. Partly it's around things like professional indemnity insurance, and where's can we share advice on which software companies to use? Can we share advice on where to buy your photocopiers from? All that sort of stuff. Can we have workshops around professional indemnity, all that kind of thing? But also Are there ways that we might enact some change externally to sort of forward the agendas that we're interested in around things like diversity, around social value? Can we use our influence to help shape the profession for the better? So it's not just about inward looking, it's also about outward facing.
Is because from what you've described, having a collaborative environment where architects and professionals can discuss challenges, common challenges, and help each other, is this what it almost sounds like? It's like a professional body, almost like what an RIBA should be doing, right? Do you see any similarities, or should the RIBA picking up some of this? And do you feel that you've had to set this up because that is missing in the industry?
Exactly right. I think we felt that these were discussions that perhaps that the RIBA it wasn't enabling. I mean, partly, and in a way can't enable, because the RIBA is a membership organisation. It's inclusive rather than exclusive, right? So you have to meet certain technical standards to become a member of the RIBA or a chartered practice. But anybody who meets those standards can become a member, and therefore you can't necessarily have those discussions, those confidential, discreet discussions. And the practices are very broad. I mean, from one person practices up to mega practices. So and what we wanted to do was make sure that those conversations were happening with other practices of the same or similar age and size and experience, so that that we can learn together and learn from one another. So it's not sorry, Ryan.
No, you go. Sorry.
I was going to say that, so it's not necessarily about replicating or performing a role that the RIBA should be doing, but it's filling a gap in something that the RIBA can't do.
So what have there been any particular, like in terms of the challenges that you're overcoming, is there anything in particular that's coming up regularly that having this network around you has helped overcome?
Yeah, there's several things. I mean, a lot of it is quite mundane. So as I mentioned, professional indemnity insurance earlier, I mean, that's a major issue for practices at the moment, all practices of all sizes. And so we're doing some work around that. Another thing is social value, and the way that particularly in the public sector commissioning, social value is being used rightly as a way of selecting architects, but perhaps not being deployed in the way that it should be, and defining social value in a slightly odd way. So we're doing some work around, some guidance around that, and in how architects can best deliver social value. But a big issue for me is around diversity and looking across the profession. I mean, clearly it's a profession dominated by middle class white men, and I'm one of them, but surely we should be doing more to try and address this huge disparity. And one of the big issues that we're one of the big topics for what we're doing is trying to address that. So the last year, some members of the London Practice Forum set up this program called the Reset Go program. So it's led by We Made That, Gort Scott and If Do, and it's a mentoring and work placement program for young people from South London from underrepresented backgrounds. And through that program, London Practice Forum members have been providing mentoring and work experience to 150 young people. And so this is direct action. It's something that we've taken on board. We've set up a whole system for mentoring and pairing mentors with mentees, and and placing young people within practice to get, who ordinarily might not get an opportunity to gain work experience within a decent architectural practice. So it's those kind of things that we want to do more of.
So on that, it include diversity and inclusion within architecture. What do you think it is that has meant that it's made, like you said, it's white middle class men? What is it that white middle class men have been drawn to it, or is it been that there's been more white middle class men or people from white middle class families going into architecture, or is it a lack of diversity coming into the profession?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, obviously, I can only speak from my perspective, which is a middle class white man. But thinking back to my own experience, I was resilient enough, and I don't mean mentally resilient, I mean financially resilient enough, and also in a position where I wasn't taking on significant debt to study architecture. And even though I was disillusioned during my part one, I stuck it out through my year out, my part two, and then realized actually this is a much broader discipline than I'd initially thought. And so I was in a position where I could do that. I could stick with it. Now I can imagine that if you're from an underrepresented background, or if you're not as financially resilient as I was, that would be incredibly disheartening, and you really get to the end of your first degree and think, is this really what it's all about? Is this really what? So I think there is an element of that. We know that there's a huge dropout rate, particularly with Black students coming through the education system, and those from economically deprived backgrounds where they can't afford to take on tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt. That's also very problematic. So that's a huge issue that we need to tackle head on.
So this initiative that's been set up to help that, how's it been received? How are you getting on? Do you have any further plans I know you're not the one leading it, but it's by some others, but is there a view to roll out other similar schemes, and how are you getting on with it so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a pilot scheme, and it was externally funded. So did apply for funding to a South London charity. So it is being externally funded, but that's really just to pay for admin costs and also to pay the staff, because the work placements, so that not the practice staff, but the work placements are all fully funded, so they get London Living Wage for the duration of their stay. So we had a young woman with us for 6 weeks, all fully paid for by this program. So it's been a pilot. It's been really successful. I mean, there are some things I think that would be changed were we to run it again, but I'm hopeful that again we can. That can be rolled out next year as well, if that's something, and potentially expanded as well.
That's brilliant. And by improving the diversity within architecture, by improving the diversity of the architects in a practice delivering a project, what outcome is that going to have on the architecture that's then delivered in that area?
I think our take on this is that working in London, we are a London-based practice. Actually, I don't know the figures. I sense probably around half our work is within London and half is outside. But when you're working in London, the places that we design, the buildings we design, the public areas, public spaces that we design, surely should be influenced by people who have experience of living in those environments. I was born in London, but I grew up in the Midlands. I didn't grow up on a council estate in Southwark, so I don't have direct lived experience of that. So surely it shouldn't just be me designing a scheme that residents are going to be living in, who have a completely different life experience to me. So and we recognize that breadth of life experience, as well as of interests and all those sort of facets of diversity, make for better buildings.
I completely agree. And you mentioned as well about adding social value. Why is adding social value important to you? Sorry, let me rephrase that. Sorry, I want to say that right, because that makes it sound like I'm questioning whether someone should believe in social value.
Yes.
But why is social value such an important topic for you, and one that you're really championing?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think partly out of frustration. I think partly it seems it's the right thing to do. We design and build buildings for people. I mean, an underlying theme to all of the practices work is that the buildings that we design have to respond to and enhance the lives of the people that live and work in them. Otherwise, and I think one of my frustrations with looking back on 20 odd years ago, when I was 30 years ago, when I was studying, my frustration with that process was that you'd go and you'd look at a book of architecture with beautiful photographs, and there was never anybody in the photos. It's all about the celebration of space, all the celebration of materials, and I never got the sense that was really what it was about. That what we should be doing is designing buildings for people, because at the end of the job, we will take photographs and put them on our website and publish a book at some point, or whatever it is architects do, and walk away, right? But people have to live in those buildings for for decades after they're finished, and so partly that's delivering social value. So if people enjoy and are able to flourish as individuals and communities within the buildings that we design, then that's a successful project. So that's one facet of social value. But I also think that the process itself can deliver social value. So the process of design can deliver social value. Now, one of my frustrations with the way that social value seems to be heading at the moment is that it's because it's difficult to quantify. How do you score somebody for their social value contribution when you're assessing a tender, which is typically what's happening at the moment, particularly in the public sector? An easy way to do is just have a spreadsheet and say, right, well, are you going to take on an apprentice? Are you going to contribute a proportion of your fees to a local charity or whatever? It's a tick in a box, but it's not really delivering social value in the way that we would want to do. I used this example in a recent interview for a project. Now, I could go and stand in front of a class of primary school kids and talk about what it's like to be an architect for 6 hours or whatever it is. That's 6 hours of my time. But what's the outcome? So what's the social value outcome of that? I would be better spending an hour of my time talking one-on-one to a young person from an underrepresented background and persuading them to go into planning or to study architecture or something. The outcome of that is significantly greater. One of our very first projects we haven't talked about was we had a very lucky break on working on a community centre in South London, which won lots of awards. It's a really great building, and it's still really loved by the people that use it. But the key outcome of that project for us was we worked with young people from the local area, from the local council estate. Every single young person that was involved in a design process, and it was a proper co-design process. Every single young person that was involved with that project either went on to education, training, or employment. Now that's what this is about. That's what the outcome should be. It's not about having a beautiful building at the end of it. We always say that we can do a beautiful building, but what else can it do?
That's brilliant. What a great story. But that's the problem. How do you judge that at a tender stage? How do you know which practice is going to be able to do that? Is there an answer to that question, do you think?
I'm not sure there is. I think the answer is like any. like anything, I mean, when you're looking at, if you were comparing people on just design, for example, you can't score it. It's not a tick box. You can look at two projects and say, well, I like that one a little bit better than I like that one. In a way, the social value responses should be similar. That it's taking a view of all of the things that are being proposed, not trying to reduce it to the number of hours or the cost, but taking a sort of holistic view of the offer and putting them side by saying, actually, comparatively, I think that's a better solution than that one. But it's really tricky.
But it must be great though, being part of a forum of practices where it's not just your thoughts and ideas and opinions on how to add social value. You've got a whole group of peers in similar sized practices doing similar work that can all share ideas. It must be so powerful having that. But on that, I suppose, why do you think this hasn't happened before? Like a formal kind of forum for practices all going through similar challenges?
I'm not sure. I think there are some other groups that have previously been set up with larger practices, informal groupings. They don't announce, but obviously these discussions happen all the time with practice principles. And what's really interesting is to see that there are other groups now starting to form. So there is a group in and around Lewisham that's sort of coalescing as well, which has a website and they're doing a similar thing. So it's I don't want to say that London Practice Forum was the catalyst for that, but I think the idea of setting up these localized groups of practices is really strong. I think that one of the things that we've been very careful about, one of the things that we really want to promote is our principles and ethical charter. So we have also tried to galvanize around the idea of what a practice should be, and establish some principles for how we behave, both internally with respect to staff and suppliers, but also within the wider world. So all of the members of the London Practice Forum are now expected to sign up to our principles and ethical charter, which contain some things which are quite challenging. So we do say in there, for example, that no practice should have anybody working for any length of time greater than 40 hours a week, right? So I think that excessive working hours are a huge issue in our profession. They exclude a lot of people who might be carers or might have to look after children or whatever it is. And the culture of long hours in architecture, I think, is hugely damaging, and it's hugely detrimental to diversity. So if we can start to establish a framework of limiting long hours, then maybe that's something that can promote greater diversity in the profession.
On that topic of long hours, to almost, not to play devil's advocate, but to kind of challenge that. I mean, I don't agree with long hours, but to challenge that, because I hear this is a topic. It's a huge topic for architects, and Part 2s especially a big frustration for them. Long working hours, unpaid overtime, but I speak to a lot of business owners as well who say, look, we don't necessarily want to not pay architects for the time, but it becomes like, how do you overcome, the fees for projects are just getting lower and lower, the margins are getting smaller and smaller, and if all of a sudden, because I know there'd been talk about the RIBA forcing practices to pay overtime, right, which great in principle, but if all of a sudden that means that the project that you bid for and you've won suddenly becomes unprofitable, that means you're losing jobs. But then if a practice says, yes, okay, we're going to pay all of our overtime, fees will go up on projects. And does that mean that those clients are then going to look to either automate or outsource to other places where, they can do it for a lower price? Like how do you kind of square those two issues between still being competitive on projects while still doing the right thing and paying the staff what they deserve?
Yeah, I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. If you on one hand, if you're saying we can't afford to we can't afford to pay our staff for overtime, but also, because the fees aren't there, well, then raise your fees. And if you can't run a business without exploiting staff working long hours, then quite frankly, you shouldn't be in business. Now, the counter argument to that is, well, fees are going down and down. As you say, margins getting narrower and narrower. This has to come from the clients. It has to come from the clients. It's no good the RIBA saying mandating overtime, because what will happen is people will stop being chartered practices. Or stop being members of the RIBA, and then RIBA members will be excluded from bidding for jobs because they're up against practices that don't adhere to those standards. So that doesn't work. What has to happen is clients need to be realistic about how much a project costs to resource properly. And things are changing, right? And I think that we are seeing a gradual shift. I think that clients, I'm talking particularly in the public sector, because private sector clients can do pretty much what they like. In the public sector, there is a realization that if you want to promote, better diversity, and you want to deliver social value, and you want to deliver sustainable buildings, and you want to have design quality and buildings that last a long time and all that stuff, you have to pay for it. You can't just go to whoever's going to give you the lowest give you the lowest fee, because it's no longer possible to claim ignorance about what that means. Now, I was involved with a design competition last year. I helped the City of London because I also have a separate interest in public procurement, which we haven't got time to talk about. But I worked with the City of London on procuring an architect for a new pavilion in Finsbury Circus, and there were a lot of very interesting initiatives that we put into the tender. One of which was what's called mean, narrow, average method of scoring for price. Right. It's a bit geeky, but what it does is it scores you the highest points for the closest you get to the average fee. So what everybody's trying to do is work out how much it costs to properly resource that project and aim for that. If you go too high, you lose. You lose points. If you go too low, you lose points. So really everybody's aiming for the optimum price point, because in that case, the City of London recognised this is a complex, high-profile project. They need an architect. They need a designer that is going to do the job properly. And these kind of things are, starting to sort of seep through into the public sector consciousness. I think recognizing that we can't meet all of the challenges of today without paying architects properly for their work.
I've never heard of that scoring structure before, but it's such a good idea. It's brilliant. So I wanted to come on to another, I guess, coming on to a topic that the whole idea of the London Practice Forum is collaboration, right? Or it seems that it's collaboration, and architecture as a practice. I think architects are always talking about collaboration within the studio. Everyone's very much encouraged to be collaborative, but there's often a block for practices being collaborative, because I come back to a story. Actually, it was many years ago, and it was a very, very, very senior member of a large international practice that I knew, and they'd just won a big football stadium project. They'd never delivered one before, and he was explaining to me how part of what they were going to have to do was build out all the individual components and families in Revit and BIM to build this stadium, when there will be another practice that maybe even just a year ago has built out those exact models in Revit themselves, paid for all that time, and yet architecture is such a collaborative industry internally, yet there's not enough collaboration between practices that imagine the cost saving and the amount of time and a better allocation of time and resources. Like, what do you think it has been historically that there's so much collaboration inside practices, but yet such reluctance to collaborate into practice. Like, what do you think has led to that, and how have you kind of overcome people's skepticism to be able to form the London Practice Forum?
I think that historically practices, particularly bigger ones, were very siloed and very competitive and very careful about what they shared with others. And that's fine. There's a healthy competition between practices is good for everyone. What we're seeing now is, and partly again, this is driven by more enlightened public sector clients, that they are requiring collaboration as a condition of appointing work. So, for example, we've been working with Michael Riches on the Bridgewater Master Plan for the Olympic Park, in collaboration with Gord Scott and ZCD and Fifth Studio, who are doing the adjacent project. Now, that's a really healthy collaboration environment, and the Olympic Park, the LLDC, wanted that collaboration to happen as a condition of wanted a collaboration to happen as a condition of awarding the project. We've seen the same thing with Meridian Water recently, where Enfield Council has required the winning practice, because it's usually led by a larger practice. In this case, Meridian 4, in this case it was Carrick Switch Carson, has required them to bring on board a number of smaller practices, and including practices which are either or majority led by women or people from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background, to be part of their teams. So mandating collaboration is becoming more of a thing. But we've found over the course of the last 3 years that we still have a healthy competitiveness between the members of the practice forum. We're competing against each other all the time on projects, but you don't mind losing against another practice who is respects the same things that you do. And it's always disappointing, of course, but it isn't putting in insanely low fees, also isn't requiring staff to work ridiculously long hours or whatever. It's the way forward, isn't it? I mean, collaboration is absolutely it's better for everyone. It enriches the projects that we do. We need to be much more open and honest and share our experience, because it's the only way to compete in this, in the contemporary world.
No, I think it's great. I think not enough people do collaborate. And you mentioned something earlier as well about, not earlier in this, but in a previous conversation we've had about, tell me a bit about what benefits architects have by working for one of the London Practice Forum companies.
One of the big benefits that we haven't talked about yet is we have a method of sharing staff. So when you're in a small practice, your resource requirements can be lumpy. You'll have a project which might last a few months, and you need to get you need to put lots of people on it in order to meet planning deadline, and tender deadline or something. But then it can flatten out again. So you typically have this sort of profile. I mean, we see it now, even a practice of our size. You have this sort of up and down in your resourcing requirements and your fee income. At the same time, other practices are seeing the opposite happen. It's the same, there's the same sort of ebb and flow of work, but the peaks and troughs are in different places. So realizing this and enabling practices to take on new staff with a degree of confidence, we've initiated this staff sharing arrangement where, with agreement with all parties, the two practices and the individual, these short-term transfers can take place. A secondment can take place, where if a practice has too many people, they can lend somebody to practice with not enough for a short period of time. And this has happened consistently over the last 3 years, and we've got examples of practices of both lent and received staff. Which has been, it allows you to keep staff rather than having to lay people off if you go through a lean period. Allows you to keep staff. The staff themselves are benefiting from the experience of working in another great practice, getting different, maybe experience on different types of projects, different ways of working. So this promotes this sort of inter practice dialogue. Sharing knowledge about systems, about procedures, about how you go about working, all that sort of stuff. So that's been amazing. It's been really useful.
That staff sharing is such a good idea, not just for the architects who are going to get a really rich experience of working in different environments, but I mean, other recruitment companies are going to hate me saying this, but most recruitment companies make more money on supplying contract or temporary staff to studios, and what you've effectively done is replace the need for a company to bring in a temporary member of staff through an agency, and another company having to make somebody redundant by giving companies the confidence to hire permanent staff and know that it's a flexible resource. It's a great idea.
Exactly right. Now, the challenge, of course, is that that only works if the practices are all of the practices and all the staff within those practices are confident that the practice they're going to go to has adopted a similar similar ethos. They need to be a good design practice, and all of the practices in the practice forum are great designers. And this is where the ethical charter comes in again, because all of the practices have signed up to the ethical charter and the sort of the principles that are enshrined within it. So what I suppose a risk of expansion would be that you broaden it out and perhaps the criteria become a bit more flexible, which would maybe limit the attractiveness of it. But thus far, I mean, it's been fantastic. We don't have any figures. We're not tracking how many people have gone backwards and forwards, but I suspect it's probably somewhere in the region of at least 20 or 30 over the course of the 3 years.
That's brilliant. No, really, really interesting. And it's just a great example of somebody thinking of something different that hasn't been tried yet and making it work. So no, hats off to you. Brilliant concept. It's brilliant. Yeah. So I guess we could chat. I've got so much more I would want to ask you about London Practice Forum and everything you've done, but we are kind of running out of time. And I want to ask you a bit more before we wrap up about advice for other people, other architects who are watching this video, who are either watching it because they're entrepreneurial and may think that they want to start up their own practice one day, or perhaps are just interested in your insights in how they can improve. I guess if somebody was thinking of starting their own practice, maybe now or maybe in 5-10 years time, they think that one day they probably would like to have a go at it. What sorts of skills and experience do you think they should be trying to gain now that's going to put them in a better position in a few years to start their own studio?
I get the sense that the part 3 education that young architects now get is much richer and much broader than it was when I was doing my part 3. So already I think that young architects are probably better equipped than we were. I also think that the sort of procurement environment is improving, so that there are greater number of opportunities for young practices, particularly in collaboration with more established firms. So again, I think that's probably I don't want to say easier, but more established as a principle than it was when we set up. Unfortunately, I think the secret to this is really about networking, and I don't mean playing golf, but going out and meeting people who have established practices, talking to them about your interests, teaming up potentially for tenders, all that sort of thing. It's really about establishing a network of like-minded people, learning from people. And remember, the practice forum, and the practice forum came out of a network that had of other people that I knew that we'd formed our practices together over the year. I mean, some are slightly older than or more established than others, but broadly we tended to have set up at a similar time, and our practices have grown at a reasonably similar pace. So it's really about establishing those connections with other people and going out and talking and meeting people and I think that would be my number one suggestion.
Great advice. And if you were speaking to a younger version of yourself that was setting up now, would you have any particular advice other than networking around? I don't know. Should somebody be learning more about how to win projects, or are you seeing any particular project areas seem to take off or get busier than others right now, without giving away all your tips to people that aren't in the London Practice Forum?
I think one of the pieces of advice perhaps would be around being confident about who you are. I think, just after winning the European competition and thinking that we were on a sort of this trajectory, which turned out not to be the case, because had we built European, I mean, it'd been a huge project, but we then, I don't think we quite knew who we were as a practice. So I remember this dreadful photograph that we took. We had headshots taken, us wearing suits. I think which is like, this is what it means to be professional, is wearing a suit, and it wasn't us, and it took us a long time, I think, to really be comfortable in our own skins and to find out what we were interested in and pursue that, not thinking that we have to go off and we have to immediately start talking to housing developers or whoever. Really just pursue the things that you're interested in, because architecture is a very, very broad discipline, and becoming broader. And I think that there's no point doing stuff that you don't enjoy. Follow the things that you're really interested in, and somehow you'll make it work.
Yeah, great advice. I think people can tell when you're not being yourself as well, and people buy from people, right? And so
absolutely right.
Real article.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, it was I look back now and cringe at some but it was a learning experience for us. We had to go through that, I think, but it's perhaps, again, it comes with a bit more maturity and with the advantage of hindsight, but we're now doing the kind of work that we always wanted to do.
Great.
But it's taken us 15 years to get
there. Great. Well, I'll finish on the last question that I like to ask everybody, which is, and we may have covered this already by talking, but in your opinion, what's the most important issue or topic in architecture right now that not enough people are addressing?
We have kind of talked about this, I think. I mean, clearly is the climate crisis, right, which is an existential and immediate threat. And I think that is there are people far better qualified than me to talk about that. So, but I do think that this issue of social value is a really big topic. So I won't talk about that again. But I think we need to come together as a profession and really understand and really promote what we think social value is, and I don't think that's really happening enough. So we need to have an honest discussion amongst ourselves and more widely within the industry about how we deliver social value, because it's not spreadsheets. It is much richer and much more inclusive and much broader than simply distilling everything down to a number in a spreadsheet. But I don't think we're quite there yet, and that's something we desperately need to resolve.
Great. Well, Russell, look, thanks so much for coming on today. For the viewers and the people listening who want to find out more about RCKa and the London Practice Forum, where should they be looking?
So you can go to our website, rcka.co.uk. The practice forum is practiceforum.london. And there are, various social media channels associated with both of those. So that's probably the best place to go to in the first instance.
Great. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, I will, all of those links that Russell's just mentioned, I will put in the description so you can go straight to them and find out a bit more and get in touch with Russell if you want to find out more as well directly. But look, thanks so much again for coming on today. It's been a pleasure to have you. And for everybody watching and listening at home, thanks for joining us once again.